involved in the hardcore scene. It was sort of an outgrowth of punk. I was into punk back from 1977. My gateway was The Damned. I just had heard them on a radio station and was interested and just started following punk music. And then, by about 80, 81, the hardcore thing came along, the Bad Brains, the Black Flag, and I was all into that. I just really liked, fast velocity, aggressive music, and hardcore was, appealed to me. Well, the late 70s, it was kind of tough because if you were a teenager, you're kind of shut out because it was very small. There was only one club, the Hot Club, which was an over 21. Mm-hmm. And mind you, you used to be able, if you get into 18, they were kind of, they weren't the most strictest about it, but it was just not very accessible if you're 16, 17 years old in the suburbs. So it just wasn't really that much. I do remember, Pure Hell back in the 70s, the Stickman, the Reds, as far as Philadelphia bands. And so it was really, the early 80s was when it really started going with like all ages shows. Well, back in the 70s, there was the Hot Club. There was another club called Artemis. The Hot Club was at 21st and South Street. That was kind of like the main punk club, which opened up in late 1977. Mm-hmm. There was another club, Artemis, at 20th and Walnut, that was sort of a kind of a backup venue. Like there was a fire at the Hot Club in '88. It was shut down for a little while, so Artemis kind of had it there. Really, other than that, that was pretty much it as far as underground punk rock. There was a few bands like if they were big enough, might play like the Tower. The Ramones played the Tower in '78 with the Jam and the Runaways. The Clash played the Walnut Street Theater in 1979 with the Undertones.
What do we have in Philly?
The earliest hardcore bands, I'd say, it started emerging around like 1981. It depends on what you're defining hardcore. I guess there was, the Sadistic Exploits, who they were kind of pretty influenced by Crass, the British anarchist band. There was the Autistic Behavior, who were kind of spread out. One of the guys lived in Philly, one of the guys lived in Central Jersey, but they pretty much, Philadelphia was their show base. They opened for a lot of the early touring hardcore bands such as Black Flag, the Dead Kennedys, TSOL. So I'd really say, and there was a band, the Proteins, who were kind of a teenage punk band during the Hot Club era, and who, were playing all ages shows around that time. So it just depends on what you're defining punk and hardcore. There was definitely sort of a little bit of a break around '81. Some of the punk bands were a little bit more influenced by the New York and the British bands. The hardcore kind of took more of their cue from like Black Flag, the Kennedys, the Bad Brains. That was the day Washington D.C. kind of got their asses handed to them by Kensington. Well, see, the thing was, Washington was the first crew of like hardcore kids on the East Coast. Ian MacKaye and Henry Rollins and the Teen Idols had been out west, and they had met up with the Huntington Beach surf punks, hardcore kids, and they kind of brought that look back to Washington, with the shaved heads and the slam dancing. So the Washington crew kind of, back in the spring of 1981, they came up to Black Flag and the Dead Kennedy shows in New York, and they kind of thrashed all over the New York crowd, which New York crowd still was sort of into that, Johnny Thunders, Ramones kind of thing, with the leather jackets and the spiky hair, whatever. And so they kind of came up and thrashed and terrorized on them. So Black Flag finally came to Philadelphia to play the Starlight Ballroom, and it was SOA, Henry's band, was the support band. It was their final show, so they came up to Philly to do the same thing, but they kind of ran into the wrong people. There was always Kensington kids that would kind of just be allowed into these shows. The Starlight Ballroom had been having shows there for a while, for like a few months. It was pretty sporadic. They had like the Stranglers, X, And the Philly punks who would go there, you kind of knew when you went up there, like, you know, be very cool with the locals. You just can't walk into Kensington and you know, with an attitude or screw with anybody. But the Washington kids, they didn't really know, you know, they just like came up, and I actually came up early to try to warn these guys in Washington, like, listen man, these locals here, tread lightly with them. You don't want to mess with these guys. It's like, see them row houses over there? If anything breaks loose, you know, these people can just pour out of these houses in a minute. But they just didn't have any concept of it. They just looked at me like, the Washington guys looked at me like, yeah, right. And it's just a cultural shock, you know, these kids, you know, they weren't, Washington kids, they weren't like pussies or anything, but they were still like kind of middle class, upper middle class kids, you know. And Kensington was just, you know, Kensington.
Yeah.
So it's kind of started between the Kensington and the crew of Philly people. There was like tension and some fights breaking out. But then once a Kensington guy got caught in the crossfire, the Washington kids jumped this Kensington guy, and this Kensington guy left the show and just was like, "You motherfuckers are dead." So everyone from Philly at the show knew, all right, this guy's coming back with reinforcements. Let's get the fuck out of here. And my friends would do like the same thing, but I was just like, Black Flag was playing. It was so awesome, man. I was just like, nah, I can't walk out on this, you know. And then, so, you know, I kind of figured, well, you know, maybe I'll just sneak off on the side while, you know, Kensington and Washington people fight. So what happened was one of the guys from Kensington came back, and he sort of drew these guys outside. He got them to chase them outside and up a side street, and then once these guys came up the side street, this guy's posse was waiting there with bats, tire irons, and he just boom, just pounded the fuck, just you know, went to town on the Washington kids. So then when they got done, you know, on the side street, the Kensington guys came back to the front of the hall and just sort of clean up whoever they didn't get already.
Did they get the SOA at all, right, or the Black Flag? Or did they
no, Flag was still up in the dressing room. I mean, this was sort of happened right at the end of Black Flag set. So the people who put on the show just locked the front doors. And I remember like looking out there, and then this like policeman pulls up. And he didn't even get out of his car because there's just like one cop there. He's not gonna, you know. And then, so finally, once the police got reinforcements, it sort of all
phased.
But meanwhile, yeah, the Washington guys, they took them all around to the St. Chris's Hospital around the corner. Some of them guys got hurt pretty bad. It was just, you know.
And then a year later, we had what, Dead Kennedys? I heard.
Yeah. Yeah, the Dead Kennedys ended up playing the same place a couple months later. And it wasn't a really good idea. What happened was the Dead Kennedys were supposed to play at Broad and South Street. And then there was kind of weird thing, this DJ, this one college DJ, new wave DJ back in the time, he had this like childhood feud with Biafra or something. He had this long-standing running thing with Biafra. So anytime the Kennedys came to town, he tried to like undermine the shows. It was weird. It was a very... So anyhow, the show got canceled and just got put up to the Star 8 Ballroom at last minute, and everyone kind of knew, oh man. But you know, people came out anyhow to see the Kennedys, so while everyone was standing out front waiting for, you know, the doors to open, some guy drives by in a car and throws a homemade bomb made out of like, you know, I had like, you know, BBs, whatever, inside a glass bottle, so it just went boom, exploded on the ground, and like people got hurt. You know, one girl had her ankle shredded up for a couple months. And then there was just like, yeah, it was kind of warfare all night, man. Just the Kensington people rushed the show, fights breaking out. Like, I remember the Dead Kennedys roadie, you know, like, you know, somehow the Kennedys got through a full set. But I remember like the Dead Kennedys roadie, he had like an amp on his shoulder running out the hall, like going boom, 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 punching people. And yeah, that was it. It was just, you know.
Wow.
I mean, it wasn't even like a thing of punks, you know, it was just more of a thing.
Territory.
Kensington people, that's their turf, that's your neighborhood. You go in there, you got to respect them.
It's like the Wanderers. The Ducky Boys. It's like the Wanderers movie.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's like, I don't care how bad you are, you got a crew, you got a posse, whatever, you just can't go into Kensington. Like I said, you can get 1,000 people poured out of them houses in a minute. And these people, they're tough. You know? For the most part, the shows in Philadelphia were pretty peaceful and fun. Everyone knew everybody. If an outsider came in starting trouble, you know, everyone knew to kind of, you know, not even beat the hell out of them, just like grab them and get them the hell out of there. You know, people got along as friends. I mean, you know, people had sort of minor beefs with each other from time to time. But that, you know, happens everywhere.
How was, you brought it up earlier, who was Howard Saunders to Philly? Very important?
Yeah, I can't stress enough how important it was. See, I think with Philly, it had a hard time getting the all-ages scene going just because everyone was kind of scattered. Like for instance, in New York, they always had CBs, and they always had the East Village, just where people could meet up. And there just wasn't really a steady place going where people, you know, could make alliances, meet other people to form bands, or whatever. So for a couple of years, while things were really happening in New York, Boston, and Washington, it just wasn't happening in Philly. There was just no places, just nothing really got together. There was places, you know, they'd have a show, it would get shut down. You know, with Philly, especially back then, it was a city of small towns put back and forth. I mean, you know, put back in front of each other. You know, you had this dividing line of South Street, and back in the day, when you went below like South Bainbridge Street, you weren't in, you know, Bella Vista or whatever. You were in South Philly. And if you didn't belong there, if you weren't from there, the people let you know it, you know. Same with Kensington, Fishtown, wherever. So you only had like a real small area, Center City, and maybe University City, where, you know, that were safe zones, and it was just hard to find places. So what Howard did, he hooked up the place to Love Hall. I guess he was able to get it. And back around like '83, it was going through a real bad Reaganomics recession. I mean, everyone was shit broke. Howard worked at the post office at the time. He worked at the 30th Street. And back then, that was just like, man, you got the real good job, you know, boy, you're rolling in it. So Howard had the money to, you know, put up for halls, and Howard was a dealer too, you know, he's a good, you know, good people person, and, you know, so eventually got Love Hall going, and he finally got, you know, a steady place for shows, and that kind of made the big difference. It was where YDI got to start and play all the time. FOD emerged at that time, McRad. So, yeah, I can't really stress enough, like, from what Howard did, he really established the Philadelphia hardcore scene. McRad were just little kids at the time, man. Chuck, man, what was Chuck, maybe 16, 17? Yep. Ethan, the singer, they were all just really, you know, the bass player was like 14, 13 or something. Just young kids, you know, Chuck's a talented dude, and you know, he got it going, and you know, they had the whole skate thing going. I think they all sort of got to be friends from skating first and then hardcore. And yeah, you know, they just like jumped right in there. They were good from the start, you know. You know, like Philadelphia hardcore in the 80s, it didn't get recognized much at the time. I think there was, you know, it was kind of in the shadow of New York in the late 70s, then was kind of in the shadow of DC in the 80s, and then kind of back in the shadow of New York by the mid-80s once the New York hardcore thing really got together. So, but on the other hand, there were shows all the time. The shows were fun. There was really little violence. Bands liked playing here. And I think everyone who went to the shows could look back on it, you know, like that it was fun. And